Welcome to Out of the Question, a podcast that looks behind some common questions and uncovers the question behind the question while providing real solutions for biblical world and life view. Your host is Andrea Schwartz, a teacher and mentor and founder of the Chalcedon Teacher Training Institute.
Welcome to another edition of the Out of the Question podcast. Oftentimes people ask me, how do you come up with your questions? Well, usually they have to do with things that I'm thinking about, things that I wonder what people who have more experience and more knowledge than I. And my guest today is someone who had been recommended by Martin Celebretti, Vice President of Chalcedon, as someone who could speak on a wide variety of subjects. Well, I've been thinking about citizenship, what it means. And, as a Christian, we consider ourselves citizens of heaven. And even Paul the Apostle used his Roman citizenship to his advantage. So I'm not sure today people really understand citizenship, which gets tied in with the entire immigration issue. So the question I'm posing today to my guest, Steve Sampson, is, does citizenship mean anything anymore? So, Steve, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome. Let me just give you a little background. I retired as a professor of government at the Helms School of Government at Liberty University almost 4 years ago. I continue to pursue my projects. I write quite a few articles. I've been distilling lectures into articles into columns, and hopefully columns will become chapters of books in the future.
So as someone who has concentrated his career in terms of teaching government policy, things like that, citizenship is very much a political issue, because if you're a citizen, it means that you're part of a certain kind of government. Do I have that right?
Yes. Citizenship is something very specific, but it is something that I think we are losing an understanding of.
So when the Republic was founded, there was a certain understanding as to what it meant to be a citizen. Could you share a little bit about that?
Well, a citizen of a country is someone who has legal rights to vote, to speak out in public on public matters of concern. It is someone who is recognized as belonging to the country, and when overseas, one is also protected under the laws of the country.
So citizenship has privileges, and as
Yes.
I've been taught recently, to make sure that we don't ever say that government grants rights, that governments recognize rights. So when the Constitution was formulated, it mentioned the word citizen a number of different times. These particular things had to do with certain people, not everybody in the world.
Yes. With the Constitution of the United States, there were some arguments over citizenship in the United States as opposed to citizenship in individual states. And of course, there were different views that were argued about. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution following the Civil War was designed in part to recognize the rights of those who had not been seen or regarded as citizens previously, but who were native-born on American soil, and many of whom had been in bondage.
So explain the difference, because some people might not even see it as a particular distinction. What's the difference, for example, being a citizen of Ohio as opposed to, and being a citizen of the United States?
Well, the one is included under the other. So an Ohio citizen is also a citizen of the United States, Ohio being part of the United States. But the United States is also a federal system. And while there were arguments from the beginning over how much latitude individual states had in determining who was a citizen of the state, they certainly could set requirements for voting, and those voting requirements often differed. It was New York, Virginia, and Massachusetts that were among the earliest to drop property qualifications for the right to vote. So the right to vote is an aspect of citizenship. So you could be a citizen and still not have the right to vote within the state, which is an interesting concept to people today who are unaware of the distinctions that were made.
Many people today, especially those who understand the biblical nature, or the unbiblical nature, I should say, of government taxing land and property, that the power to tax basically says or designates some degree of ownership. And so quite possibly the distinction about a property owner voting as opposed to someone who was not had something to do with stability and the interests not only of the present, but for the future as well.
Yes. Now, it was in England that there was a saying that a man's home is his castle. That was a part of the common law tradition. Unfortunately, it's not clear that that was carried over in the thinking of early Americans. Again, this is a fundamental issue that needs to be explored. I don't have a clear-cut answer, but I do approve of the concept. And I believe that it is biblical in its foundation.
And of course, the question, and that's not the focus of what we're talking about today, but if you didn't have property taxation, if you didn't have a central banking system that sort of promoted inflation, more people would be able to own land because they would keep more of what they made. So since we didn't have an income tax and we didn't, I believe, have a property tax at the outset, what we're looking at today is very different than the context of when the Constitution was ratified.
Yes. What has changed especially since the Civil War, but even before the Civil War, with the change of property qualifications for voting, what has changed is the rise of an administrative state that you might say is superimposed upon the original Constitution. And so we had early amendments, but following the Civil War, some of the amendments that followed did have a tendency to concentrate power at the center, so that a federal system became increasingly a national system also. It's not that the federal aspect disappeared altogether, but one great scholar of the Constitution, Edward Corwin, in the early part of the 20th century and mid-century, wrote about the effect of total war on the Constitution. And he distinguished between a constitution of rights, which we began with, and a constitution of powers, I believe he called it.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's known that after a war, government, the state consolidates its power, you might say.
Yes.
To talk a little bit about the idea that the federal government was a federation of states. So you remained a citizen of your state. And I've had people point out that in the document itself, citizen with a capital C appears, as does in the 14th Amendment and subsequently citizen with a lowercase c. Is there some
Yes.
differentiation between the choice of a capital or not a capital letter?
Well, without pondering that, I will beg off a clear-cut answer. It is worth exploring, though. Certainly after the Civil War in the 1880s, an Assistant Attorney General of the United States in the Cleveland administration wrote a little book entitled Poison Drops in the Federal Senate, in which he contended that the original Webster's Dictionary and the Webster Dictionary of 1828 was designed to reflect the understanding of political language that prevailed at the time of the founding of the country. And so Noah Webster, as an early patriot, wanted as an educator to preserve the thought of the founding generation. And this was his great legacy, which was continued by his son-in-law. I actually have a copy of the Webster's Dictionary that his son-in-law, Chauncey Goodrich, as I recall, edited. And I sometimes consult that dictionary. But what happened, and this was a charge lodged by Zachariah Montgomery, is that following the Civil War, the school, so-called Webster's dictionaries, began changing the definitions to reflect a more nationalistic view.
Once again, you see how education is important and the definition of words. Back then, the definition under contention was what it meant to be a citizen. Now, unfortunately, what it means to be a man or a woman is under attack. So I don't think anybody should ever underestimate the importance of grammar and definitions.
Correct.
So what's the net effect of loyalty in terms of citizenship? I doubt today many people would consider themselves more loyal to their state government than they would to the federal government. From your perspective, if we were going to remedy some of the social ills that we see, is one more preferable than the other?
Well, the progressives of a century ago thought that it was easier to change the laws at the national level than to try to do so at the state level, since there were so many states. And so the language that many of them used, in fact, treated the states as if they were very parochial, and it's the national government that represents the best interests of the people. And some of them use language like the Constitution is a product of a horse and buggy mentality and age, while they wanted something that was more up to date. Many of them favored a parliamentary sort of system. In any case, they brought over ideas, particularly developed in Germany, educational ideas that came to, you might say, infiltrate the educational system. Graduate schools were started following the German model. Johns Hopkins University was the first of these. I have done a lot of research on Francis Lieber, who was an interesting figure who came over from Germany as part of an early migration of German scholars. He was someone who was very critical of Hegel, but he did move to Massachusetts. He was part of the literary circles there for many years. But he is also someone who had developed a real appreciation for what he called Anglican liberty, to which he added American liberty, in contrast with what he called Gallican liberty, a French administrative centralized tradition that is more akin to what the progressives were seeking. So they sought to centralize power in order to bring about the political reforms they sought, rather than go through the regular mechanism.
We see that today with every president decides if he can't get legislation the way he wants it, he signs executive orders. And so,
Oh, yes.
From a child's point of view, the way America currently operates, it looks like, well, my house, my rules. So if it's kind of a scary thought to me, Steve, actually, that you can have somebody who will be diametrically opposed to what the last administration does, and then that same person has control of the military. It looks like it's a game of tug of war rather than actually governing so that people could have liberty.
Yes. This is something that I write about quite a bit. I lectured for many years, and I became increasingly concerned about the direction of our country, and I wanted to understand. And so I spent a career digging into a forgotten literature, sometimes a literature that had been deliberately dropped down the memory hole. And so I've collected a lot of things over the years, and I continue to wrestle with the issues that they raise. But I do appreciate going back to 19th and 18th century literature that presents a very different picture of the founding of our country and the purposes behind it. I do appreciate some scholars, many scholars who specialize in a certain area bring perspectives that are largely forgotten by others. Forrest McDonald is someone whose work on the American Constitution I read and actually used in class starting in the 1980s.
So would you say it's a stretch to say that the American Constitution, as it was written, presupposed a biblical morality?
I wouldn't say that it's a stretch at all, because even though there were Unitarians among the framers of the Constitution, neither Jefferson nor Adams was present at the Constitutional Convention. Both of them were, in fact, serving as ambassadors overseas, but they were in intimate correspondence with many of those who were there. But by and large, it was professing Christians who were part of the original Continental Congress that drafted the Declaration of Independence, and then later the Constitutional Convention. And Mel Bradford, M.E. Bradford, in fact, wrote a book that looked at the Christian heritage of those members of those founding bodies. More recently, Daniel Dreisbach and Mark David Hall have made contributions to that literature also. I have books going back to the 1920s that cite a literature that developed during the whole colonial period that drew upon the biblical covenant tradition. And more recent scholars have written on that very well. Also, I would mention Daniel Elazar as one. Let's see, another is Elisandos, who collected political sermons of the founding era. There's just a rich literature available to anyone who cares to dig into it.
And I think scholarship has gone the way of something that most people don't think it's their responsibility to do. I think they rely on what some people call the fourth branch of government, the media, although I think you could call the bureaucracy the fourth branch of government as well. But at the outset, when somebody was designated a citizen, did they have to be born here to be considered a citizen? Or if they had not been born here, but at the time of ratification, then they would have been included as citizens? Could you just explain that a little bit?
Well, I can't explain that in any great detail without digging into it, into the specifics, but there was a process of naturalization, and we did have some political figures like Alexander Hamilton who were not born within the existing colonies that became the new American states following independence. And he was a very powerful influence and advocate for certain views early in our history. Yes, he was a citizen, probably under the qualifications of the Constitution specifically. He would have been unable to become president. But there are, again, some, differences of opinion, and we have some people that are born to American citizens or to one member of the family who's an American citizen abroad, and questions have been raised about whether John McCain or Ted Cruz or others who have aspired to the presidency actually met the constitutional qualifications. Naturalization, in any case, has been a part of the process from the beginning, as I understand it.
Was it always a practice if somebody was born here that they automatically became a citizen?
Well, yes and no. My understanding is when you reach majority, if you were born here, as the late King of Thailand was, you either, if you're not living in the United States, when you reach majority, you have to determine whether you're going to declare citizenship or not. In the case of the King of Thailand, of course, he couldn't be the King of Thailand and a citizen of the United States at the same time.
So does the United States not allow dual citizenship, that if you're going to be a citizen of the United States, that's the only citizen you can be?
Well, dual citizenship is allowed. I don't know how common it is, and I'm not sure when dual citizenship started becoming an issue. Again, it is something worth exploring. There are people who do hold dual citizenship with other countries. My understanding is, in my case, I could go to the Swedish embassy in Washington, D.C., and apply for Swedish citizenship on the strength of my grandfather being a native-born citizen.
I see.
So this is something more recent. It's a new wrinkle that I was unaware of, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago. When I began teaching, I'm not even sure I was aware of dual citizenship as something that was even possible, let alone a reality.
And I know that with the advent of passports being required, originally the Republic didn't require passports to go in and out of the country. Do you think that as this has developed, showing your ID, having a passport, that the concept of citizenship has taken on a new color?
Perhaps that's the case. I do carry my passport with me whenever I travel, even within the 50 states. And I do a lot of travel. I was recently in Mexico, and then a couple of weeks later, I was in Texas. And it's a lot easier at the airport simply to show your passport.
I see. So let's talk about the idea, this is in one of the articles that I read that you had written, that increasingly the question you pose is, are we becoming more subjects than we are citizens? Why don't you explain that distinction?
Okay. When you raised this issue a couple of days ago, I was in the midst of writing an article, and perhaps my article got modified in the process, but I hit on a new title just this morning as I was thinking about it, Surrendering Our Birthright. And that certainly sums up that question very well. I guess it's a question of whether we're choosing to be Esau or Jacob. Citizenship is something that is very important to newly minted citizens from other countries that lived under rather oppressive conditions, who did not enjoy the historic freedoms that the American people have. East Europeans, for instance, have a clear idea of what they have left behind and what they like to enjoy as citizens of the United States. But the question is, how many Americans who have been educated in public schools, have not been taught much history, is there a price of historical negligence, such as we have seen in generations of education? I taught more than 40 years at the college level, and I certainly noticed changes in perspective and perception by students over the years. And these often reflected some of the political changes that were taking place in national politics. So during the Reagan years, students seemed to reflect more of a conservative view represented by the president. But when I began teaching in the 1970s, it was, the country was drifting very much to the left.
And one of the things that I can say from my own family background, my grandparents, both sets, were born in Italy. Both sets met here in this country, so they weren't already married. And it was of utmost importance that their children were Americans. One set of grandparents even changed how they pronounced their names to sound it a little bit more American. And yet we have a whole wave of people today who come to the country and only criticize as opposed to recognize, okay, not perfection, but that they don't want to join. So there's not a sense of belonging with becoming a citizen.
Yes, and I've seen this in students as well as others that I have encountered along the way. I recall the story of a geographer from Sweden who came over in the first decade of the 20th century and told Swedish American audiences, "You are now American." So he was opposed to hyphenated Americanism. I think Francis Lieber, the German scholar who came over and founded the first American encyclopedia. He ran the first gymnasium in Boston. He was quite a well-accomplished scholar who held the first chair of political science in this country. But he may have coined the term hyphenated Americanism, which he opposed.
Mm-hmm.
So he often addressed German Americans in those terms, and was very much in favor of preserving the Union, even in the days when he taught at what is now the University of South Carolina.
I read a book recently that spoke in terms of that America is unique in as much as if I went to go live someplace else, let's say I decided I was going to go live in France, no one would ever call me French. I'd still be an American who is living in France.
Mm-hmm.
However, in our country, when people become naturalized citizens, they're considered Americans.
Yes.
It's an interesting phenomenon.
It is, and I believe it is unique. I'm not sure that there is another country that was premised on this idea of assimilation, and yet the requirement of assimilation has fallen by the wayside, so that people can become citizens without learning the language, without identifying with the culture or the values that were instilled into the system at the beginning. America is treated as an experiment that just is continually overturning and churning along, changing everything, and which seems to suit the notions that some people have. They would prefer something fluid that they can direct and channel in ways favorable to their interests. I
Right.
think of the Fabian Society motto. There is a stained glass window that George Bernard Shaw helped to design, which had as a motto, mold it to the heart's desire. And there's a picture of Shaw and Sidney Webb hammering away at a globe on top of an anvil. So they were reshaping the world according to the heart's desire.
And in some states, and I live in one of them, in the state schools, oftentimes you will have classes that are not in English because the children can't necessarily understand it. And I remember meeting a high school civics teacher who taught only in Spanish. He didn't have a real fondness for the United States Constitution. And he pointed out to me, thinking I would agree with him, which I didn't, but he thought I did, that he could teach these students whatever he wanted to teach them about the Constitution because the administration didn't speak Spanish.
Yes, I have seen how closed some immigrant communities become, and how particularly older members of the community do not learn the language. This is to some degree understandable.
Mm-hmm.
The learning of a new language becomes more difficult the older you are, and I do well to master my own language. I took Spanish, I took German, but I made sure that my children developed an ear for language. And so my youngest child, well, all of them are linguists to a degree that I can't imagine.
Well,
Yes.
I told you about my grandparents. I know my paternal grandmother. I don't think she ever really spoke English, but she would make a point of finding somebody in the building or the neighborhood who was good at English, and she would exchange loaves of bread for them tutoring her children. And my father, one of her 7 of her children, ended up being a medical doctor. And that's how interested they were in making sure that their children would assimilate. So there was no idea that they were Italian before they were Americans. They were very proud to be Americans.
Yes, and I think that was common among immigrants throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century.
Correct.
Somewhere along the line, things have begun to change, and I think much of it has to do with, let's say, illegal forms of immigration.
And also a system that tells people that you don't have to work when you get here, that now taxpayers are being taxed in order to fund it. So it almost looks like this is a way to change the fabric of the nation by bringing people in who you don't intend to actually embrace the founding principles of the United States of America.
Yes, it certainly appears that way. And someone who was a member of the British cabinet in the late 1990s revealed in his memoirs afterwards that something like that was happening in England. So I have it quoted somewhere, so I don't recall who specifically said that, but it was a heads up to think about that. And then I ran across a little poem by a very loyal communist from East Germany, a literary figure, Bertolt Brecht, who wrote something like that in dismay over the crackdown by the East German government on the protest by public service workers in 1953. And this poem was found after his death, entitled in English, The Solution, by someone, as I mentioned, was a communist. He lived in East Germany. He was a literary figure, but there was an uprising of workers, and he was dismayed at the reaction of the government. And yet this is what we face in this country today. He wrote very simply, after the uprising of the 17th June, the Secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalin Alley stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. And then he adds with bitter irony, would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another?
Wow. It's a little bit close to home.
Oh, yes, yes.
So I do have a question that is a grammar question. So you talked in terms of a lot of people today have not been schooled appropriately on the foundation of America. And I would say the same thing is true biblically. We have lots of illiterate and ill-informed Christians. And so I've been in debates with people. Is it proper to designate ourselves as Christian Americans or American Christians? Obviously, one's the adjective and one's the noun, but you brought up Jacob and Esau, and Esau having sold his birthright. So from your perspective, and I realize this is a personal opinion, what do you think is the proper designation for believers who live in this country?
Well, we are American Christians. Christian America seems to carry a hint of a political agenda of some sort. And so I'm not comfortable with that designation, but we are Americans and Christians. Certainly our American background does to some degree channel our understanding of the faith. Sometimes that is a problem.
Are you hopeful that?
That depends on the will of the people in the end, and whether we can recover a sense of our priorities. This will require some real leadership, I would say, and that leadership needs to come from the churches, from the larger Christian community in this country, because where else is it going to come from? I have appreciated the efforts of Vishal Mangawati, for instance, to use the church as a vehicle for offering higher education with pastors acting as resources for making sure that members of the congregations have access to the best thinking by Christians in terms of various fields, academic fields.
And I think that's a brilliant idea. And what I appreciate about Vishal is how he doesn't have to start big. He's willing to start small. And yet you see things snowballing because people have realized the time to have an educated Christian populace is now if we want to preserve the founding principles.
Yes. So it takes that kind of leadership. Somebody has to get the ball rolling. And as someone from India who came to appreciate the role of missionaries in India and how they helped create modern India. India is not, in spite of efforts to turn it into a Hindu state, at its birth, it was Christians that presided over preserving the earlier languages. It was Christians who were influential in ending certain practices like sati, and something that had spread even down into areas that include today's Indonesia, for instance. And so our Western civilization, you might say, is to a great degree a project of the church going back at least 1,000 years ago. And so it's a civilization that, even though it may not, it may draw on other traditions and other foundations, but it came together, I would say, as a project of Christians who were missionaries and other Christians who led the church, who played a major role also. And so this is something I began writing about when I did research on church-state issues and wrote a doctoral dissertation that I entitled Crossed Swords. And it's really about a dynamic, a dynamism built into Western civilization that reflects the dynamism of the Christian faith.
You mentioned earlier, as we were discussing it, that you think it's probably pretty unique in terms of governments, the idea of assimilation. And yet that's really what the basis of Christianity is. When Jesus departed the earth and said, disciple the nations and bring them into a relationship with me, it doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what your background is, that membership in the body of Christ, membership in the Christian race is an assimilation into the principles and the person of Jesus Christ. So in a lot of ways, you can see that coming out of the Western thrusts and then the founding of America. I would say that there is that kind of presuppositional thinking.
Yes. And I will contrast that now with the poem, The Solution. And I would say that is part of what I call the strategy of subversion that's been at work and that I have witnessed. I was a student at the University of Colorado in the late 1960s. I saw all of what was going on at campus at that time. I was a student of Edward Rozek, who was persecuted severely by the administration, by radical leaders among the students. In the 1980s, he was even had charges brought against him and a district attorney's office investigation. And so there were powers that were determined to silence him. And so the cancel culture is nothing new to me. The cancel culture is something I've had to deal with all of my career from my student days onward. And so you might say these are the things that I write about. I write about the roots and foundations of our system of government and culture, but I also write about the forces that threaten it. Because, we human beings are fragile. Anything that is built on the fragile foundations of human beings is intrinsically at risk. And so I use words like precarious to talk about the state of the West today, because a precarious property is one where the title isn't clearly held, or at least is disputed. And of course, the title of the United States to some of its property has been disputed by neighbors in the past, by activists at the present.
Well, our time's just about up. Steve, thanks for joining me and kind of bringing a lot of these issues to the forefront. If people wanted to read more of your articles and find out more about the things that you think are important to focus on, how would they do that?
Well, I have a number of things out under my full name. You can simply Google my full name, Stephen Allen Samson, and find a great abundance of things because just about everything is out there on the web. I do write on a regular basis for Town Hall Finance, even though I don't write about finance. I write for the Market for Ideas in Bucharest. It's an English language publication. That's quite remarkable. I've gotten some of my friends to contribute to that. I write for the Western Australian Jurist. I've enjoyed being able to both travel and have my words travel as well to other places, and I'm hoping in the process I can gain a truly world view of the issues that we must face together.
Agreed. Very important. And one thing I think that maybe we'll close on this. I'm somebody who had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Dr. Rushdoony, who founded the Chalcedon Foundation. And I remember thinking, wow, here's a scholar, and you count as a scholar. Do you think becoming a scholar is a worthwhile activity for some of our youth today in preparation for wanting to make the contributions that are important to them, and maybe look at that from a point of view of it's important to delve into the past and then analyze it for people so that they can have a better understanding?
Yes, I would like people to catch the vision, you might say. Dr. Rushdoony was a remarkable scholar, and I've had the privilege of knowing not only him, but people he knew and respected. And so I've known some very brilliant people in my life, and I believe iron sharpens iron. If we interact with people who have real ideas worth wrestling with and experiences that we may not share, but experiences that they can draw upon, there is so much to learn. The New Testament refers to deeds of Jesus could fill entire libraries. And I would say that his shaping of our lives for the last 2,000 years is a story that we can learn from. Arthur Holmes wrote a book called All Truth is God's Truth. And we need to, rather than be parochial in our treatment of people's contributions, come to recognize them under the aspect of eternity.
Amen to that. Steve, thanks for taking the time with me today.
You're most welcome.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode. And if you would like to communicate about this or any other topic you would like to see us cover or someone we might interview, You can reach us at outofthequestionpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening to Out of the Question. For more information on this and other topics, please visit calcedon.edu.